Hi everyone, thank you to those who've just joined. We're giving people around a minute or two to join. We hope you're surviving this heat. And yeah, we'll be kicking off in around a minute or so. Great, we'll see more and more people join. Brilliant. Welcome to everybody. I imagine some NHS colleagues on here will be dealing with another heat health alert awareness, which is, I imagine, is coming a lot this August and July. Brill. All right, then let's kick off. Excellent. Hello, everybody. My name is Alenka. I'm one of the account directors at Blue Lozenge, and I am kind of facilitating and leading this session today with the lovely Kerry and Scott, who I will introduce you to shortly. If you don't know who Blue Lozenge is, we are a PR and communications agency that specialises in healthcare. So we focus on kind of campaigns, NHS market access, media relations, crisis communications, anything kind of in the comms and PR box we can support with. So if you'd like to find out more about our agency, then you can just click our website there. Next slide, please, Sky. So welcome to AI in the Wild, episode 2. So our first webinar, for those of you who attended, was on kind of written content and processes. But what we found was that actually a lot of people wanted to understand more about imagery and video, and we found that that was a bit of a grey area in terms of how we use AI. So I went on the hunt looking for fabulous people who were well rehearsed and knowledgeable in this field in order to upskill you, our kind of health and care comms colleagues, on how to use AI for imagery and visual responsibly and ethically. Next slide. So our lovely speakers today. So Kerry is going to be kicking off with some governance around how to use AI responsibly. She's the go-to person for executive leaders when using AI responsibly. So we're in very good hands because I know that a lot of comms professionals are very conscious about how they use this new AI tool ethically and responsibly, and Kerry can shine some light on that specifically for imagery and video. And then we have Scott, who's a creative extraordinaire who has helped many agencies, who's worked in agency and also runs Theora Consulting, and he helps companies tell stories and engage their audiences. So that is enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to the lovely Kerry now, who will talk about governance, reputation, and the kind of the things you need to think about before using AI in imagery and video. Over to you, Kerry.
Thanks very much. Okay, so we're going to cover the do's, the dot the I's and cross the T's. So governance, transparency and reputation today. Scott definitely has the fun part. The governance groundwork that I do for his section of demonstrating how awesome generative AI is for creating visuals. So I've tried to make this as interesting as it can be, but a bit of a spoiler, Scott's slides blow mine out of the water, as they should. The soapbox I stand on is all about ensuring responsible AI adoption. So AI is here to stay. It's been around for longer than people have been talking about it. And as communicators, we need to make sure it's used ethically and responsibly in what we do. Next slide, please, slide. Okay, so a bit of a backstory to open. Before I became a professional problem solver, I had a side hustle as a photographer. I'm no doubt showing my age right now, but I learned to take images with a film SLR camera and a darkroom. Everything was done by hand, from taking the photos to developing the film, editing the images and the printing process. Then it evolved into digital SLRs and editing on a computer. Photoshop became a verb. For the record, I was dead against this form of image creation. I thought it stripped away a big part of the creative process of photography, the part that happens after you've composed the image and pressed the button to capture it. Eventually I came round, I saw the benefits of digitizing photography, and I built a business taking photos for the best part of a decade. What I know from that experience is that evolution of the tools we use is inevitable, and AI in some form or another has been inside digital editing tools like Photoshop and Lightroom for years already, right? Images have generative elements already out there, even if they're taken manually. People are probably completely unaware of. Those real life images you're looking at might have used a generative fill to extend the image, or used AI to remove unwanted objects, or change the hue or the color, or anything. Like, the world's your oyster when you're editing on a computer the images that you're working with. So generative AI for me, removing the camera part of the creative process is that next step in image creation. The tools we use and adapt change. Like, from camera obscurers in the 16th century to computers today, creativity is evolving, and we need to make sure to adapt and change responsibly. Next slide, please, Sky. I feel like I'm going to trip over the next slide, Sky thing. Okay, so let's just jump into the risks versus the rewards. There's obviously more than three, both sides of the coin. But being in the healthcare sector, the risks hit harder for you. Trust is so fragile, and recovery of reputation following a breach of trust is a very slow process at the best of times. So looking at it today, like, your three main risks that you're working with are the misrepresentation of reality, a lack of transparency, and that loss of trust and credibility, which is huge. So the key thing to remember is to not get ahead of what the public is ready for. And right now it feels like a very thin line to walk, especially in the healthcare sector. On the flip side, your rewards, you're going to save time on production, it scales storytelling and the creative output, and it produces more tailored and inclusive content. So that's three big wins. Next slide, please. Your industry guidance that is out there at the moment, obviously you've got the NHS Communications AI Operating Framework, which is an incredibly big mouthful to say. You've got the CIPR, Responsible Use of AI in PR. They've recently published that last month. That basically aligns with the Venice Pledge that they signed in June 2025, and explains the 7 principles and highlights sort of issues and dilemmas that you can come across whilst using AI across the board, not just in images. And then obviously the PRCA have an AI green paper that covers the state of play of AI and PR at the moment. It talks about strengthening public trust, so like the ethics, the governance, social license, building AI confidence and competence as practitioners, and supporting the industry resilience and future readiness. All right, there's some good, strong guidance on your personal accountability within that as communications practitioners. If you haven't read all of them, I definitely recommend taking the time to look through them. And next slide, please, Guy. So I'm just going to touch very quickly on the responsible AI principles. So we've got the 6 covered. I'm assuming that you guys have all seen these, so don't panic. I'm not going to read all that text. That's the framework's wording. I just felt it was quite timely and useful to have on the slides for you guys to have a look at if you choose to. First up, obviously, you've got fairness. So your AI tool should support equitable communication. Reliability and safety, so your AI system should work as expected across contexts and different audiences. And privacy and security, which is really, really important one. You want to make sure that you're maintaining confidentiality and applying data security with everything you do. Once it's out there in the world, it's out there and you can't get it back. Obviously every trust has its own AI usage policy, so make sure you're aligning with that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so then we've got inclusiveness. So your AI should make communications more accessible, not less. And transparency wise, we're obviously looking at being crystal clear with when you're using generative AI for public and patient facing content, but also internally too. All right, so trust matters everywhere. And finally, accountability. So you're held to account, not the AI, not anyone else. Your name is the one that's on it. I deal with this quite a lot in terms of protecting your practice as communicators, but you need to sit right with that fact that it sits with you personally and not just the organization that you work for. Okay, next slide, please. So what does that look like in practice? So from my point of view, my recommendation is always start with the question, do we need to use AI for this? And if you do, why What's the reason behind using AI? Can you do it without? I mean, if you can do it without, do it without. And then run through the 6 principles every time. You want to be looking for bias and stereotyping checks on every generated visual. You want to test your outputs before anything is published. You don't want to be entering personal sensitive data into the public AI tools. Check your policies, know where that line is drawn regarding what is and isn't sensitive. And if it's not clear, check before sharing anything with an LLM. Like I said, you can't take it back once it's out there. Obviously using plain language, accessible design, cover all your literacy and access needs, and disclose when AI generated content is used. And the final point of that is to then always deliver content patients can trust. You'll see that that's the running theme through this today. And then the overarching is the accountability. So it sits across all of it. So again, you guys are responsible for every output. So it's not the tools that you're using that you can put the blame on if anything goes wrong. It's you. So sense check everything every single time. Next slide, please. So with healthcare, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but your industry. But to touch on the obvious, healthcare is a regulated sector. So with that comes higher stakes and higher scrutiny. So there's little room for error. Beyond sector specific rules and regulations, you guys are dealing with patients and the vulnerability that comes with that. The NHS is seen as an authority. So making mistakes makes a bigger splash for you. And that leads you to not only having that reputational cost of public criticism, but you have the added fun of regulatory scrutiny thrown in there as well. So navigating all of this, apart from deserving a medal, obviously, when using AI, the one phrase I would personally turn into a mantra is protect and prioritize trust. Next slide, please. So I mean, I know it's all across AI slop, but 3 is the magic number in my world. So here's 3 ways that you can protect and prioritize your trust. So first and foremost, accuracy. So you want to be checking all the visuals properly. We're talking magnifying level, glass of checking, from PPE and equipment to anatomical errors to the clinical environment accuracy. Is the branding right? AI imagery is incredible now, but errors will still show up. So you want to be vigilant and have eyes like a hawk. Altering images of real people. Check your trust usage policy first. Consent is key, and should be required if you are going to alter anything. Obviously, from the disclosure point of view, there's levels of disclosure and that should match your content. So AI used in the process, but not the finished result. You can just have an organizational statement that explains how you're using AI in your comms. On the flip side, a realistic AI generated visual needs an individual content label. So it's very clear that content is AI generated as a final product. The EU AI Act actually requires this, and whilst obviously in the UK we're not within the EU, the Act's powers cover if your output affects EU residents, not just whether you're in the EU. Okay, so you can be affected by this and you need to follow the rules and regulations on that. It is the highest regulatory bar right now, so personally I would err on the side of caution and make sure you comply with it because it's your safest bet. And then the third one is obviously explainability. This is where obviously my crisis comms preparedness part comes in, but you prepare for scrutiny before it happens, not after. So you want to document how the image was made, what was checked, who signed it off. Every point of AI contact your comms or campaign has should be recorded. Next slide, please. So I thought, if I haven't done enough to instill fear into you all just yet, we'd look at a little bit about the fallout for undisclosed AI use. Okay, and I've got 4 consequences that I'm going to touch on, but obviously that's not necessarily all of them. First and foremost, you're going to damage patient and public trust. So transparency builds trust and undisclosed use erodes it. I've said it before and I'll say it again, reputation recovery takes a long time. So the second thing to think of is that the discovery becomes the story. So you could have the best campaign in the world and that won't matter if the AI use was not clear. The undisclosed AI use will be what people talk about. So bear that in mind. You could breach professional standards. Okay, so you might not be a CIPR member, but transparency is one of the 4 pillars of their code of conduct. And that code, whilst it doesn't name AI specifically, it's written broadly on purpose. but the CRPR have said it very clearly that disclosure is expected of CRPR members. So that not disclosing is also a risk to you personally as well as your organisation. And then finally, obviously, that erosion of internal trust is present as well. You know, your colleagues, clinicians, other teams will stop judging your judgment. And then, you know, staff who distrust AI use will say so publicly. And that just pushes you further away from being able to use AI constructively at all. Next slide, please. Okay, so I did a deep dive into what's actually out there, the disclaimers in the wild, if you will. And I'm not going to lie, it is confusing. So I can understand why people are trying to get their heads around what you can and can't do, because there's conflicting information across different trusts and different parts of the country as well. I will touch on, obviously, in the quote on the slide, that is the example that the AI operating framework uses as a sign of good practice. Okay, so that I searched high and low for this statement on their website and I could not find it. I appreciate that the document was written last year, but it's not there now. And I'm very good at finding things. In my line of work, I have to put my Sherlock Holmes hat on for client projects. So for me to not find something, that raises a flag for me. You know, your organizational level disclaimer must be easy to find. Like it's just a non-negotiable. So NHS 5, they basically have said, we've got a generative AI acceptable use policy, okay, and it talks about ensuring ethical and lawful use. It strictly prohibits use of sensitive data and requirements for copyrighted material or any AI, any IP for that matter. Whereas the NHS Scotland staff are officially discouraged from using AI images to represent health and care. And the full quote that they say on their statement is, generative AI is often trained on biased and inaccurate data. This can reinforce harmful stereotypes and show poor health and care practices. It's likely to create images that don't accurately show Scotland's health and care staff, service users, or locations. This kind of misrepresentation can erode trust and undermine the credibility of our content. It can also bring copyright, legal, and reputational risks. Human connection is crucial in the work we do. Health and care, staff and patients are real people with unique identities, emotions, and experiences. Using AI to represent them can dehumanize them instead of recognizing their real life humanity. Do not use generative AI to represent health and care, staff, patients, or people, location, or interiors. Bit of a mouthful. There's nothing wrong with what they've said. It's accurate, it's true, and it's a perspective and an opinion. Bias and inaccurate data are definitely things to bear in mind when using AI, because it only knows what it knows. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way of approaching it, and I'll cover that in a slide down the road. So the East London NHS Foundation Trust say they support the tools, but only with data that's already public or self-generated. And then the content development team, they've investigated available image generators and concluded AI generated images aren't appropriate, with a caveat that there were some benefits to supporting the content development process and enhancing existing images. They also go into detail on general principles of use, verifying images with subject matter experts, which is a great idea, and provide examples of acceptable AI enhancement. Their policy document was dated April 2025. So with that a review in April 2028 or sooner if something significant happens. Image generation has moved on hugely since last year. So I find it quite interesting whether that review will come sooner rather than later, because it's ridiculously good what you can do with it now. Outside of the NHS, you've got Connection Support is a really great case study. They're a health and social care charity, and they published a highly transparent disclosure alongside their campaign that used AI generated images. They actually had a hybrid approach and explained why they did it. So the real photography was for client stories that they were happy to share, Whereas the AI generated images, they used those to avoid staging photos that would feel inauthentic or exploitative, and to illustrate emotional weight of issues without asking real people to relive that experience. And I really liked that transparency about how why they used it, and sharing that alongside the campaign. Next slide, please, Sky. Which really leads me nicely into flipping the narrative to reshape what's possible. I've stolen the Spider-Man line deliberately. With great power comes great responsibility, and using AI in your work gives you power, and that power comes with that responsibility to use it wisely. So this is my perspective on how you can use generative AI to improve the communications that you create. Right, so you've got flexibility where you can visualize scenarios you can't capture in real life, a care pathway, a future service not yet running, so moments too sensitive to film, so that the connection support flagged. Asking someone to relive a difficult experience just for a photo is not appropriate, but AI lets you show the emotional weight without putting anyone through that painful experience. Obviously, accessibility wise, we can repurpose content into alternative formats. We can connect across different audience types, which is just fantastic. And we all know how time consuming that sort of content creation can take. And then equally, representation, it can depict what your existing image library doesn't show and become more inclusive and more diverse. For example, images of sickle cell disease on dark skin tones is scarce. AI generated images could bridge that gap, but also open up conversations to source authentic real life imagery too. So this makes that AI generated visuals like a catalyst for starting conversations about building your real image assets. You can do that internally, but you could do it externally too. You could use it to initiate a campaign to find people living with a condition that would be happy to be photographed or filmed to build awareness. And like what the Connect support guys did, the why behind using AI for your images is a really powerful tool for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is my quick roundup before Scott blows your minds. Image capability is moving faster than frameworks and legislation. Trust your own ethical compass and use AI, using AI for visuals. It goes beyond just compliance right now. You want to be obviously first and foremost adhering to your organization's rules. You want to trust policies come first. If anything's ambiguous or outdated, ask before you act. That whole saying, ask for forgiveness, not permission, doesn't apply here when you're working with AI. All right, you want to use AI generated visuals to spark conversations, use it in the concept and development stage, show what's missing from your asset library, make the case for changing outdated rules, get people on board with it, spark external conversations for accurate patient representation. Speak to your stakeholders, ask patients directly. Don't assume they'll reject AI imagery. They may welcome it if it means more accurate representation. Apply the same principles as Mattel did, widening the Barbie doll range so children see themselves reflected in the dolls they play with. People want to see themselves in the situations you're depicting. And obviously, I have to end on protect and prioritize trust. You want to be transparent, make your disclaimers easy to find, in the footer of your website. Have your own comms specific AI policy, not just a general one. There's, from my research doing this, there is so much information out there, and there's some great AI hubs and tools within the NHS of explaining and helping, but it's limited information from a communication point of view. So and comms, we use it differently, so they're going to be different rules to follow and different things to explain. Monitor your stakeholder sentiment on AI image use specifically, document everything, assume scrutiny will come and be ready for it, and obviously always ask, do we need AI for this, and if so, how are we using it responsibly? Over to Scott.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Kerry. That was really great. I loved how you, and I see a few round of applause there. Thanks, guys.
I need a big glass of water now.
Brilliant. So one thing that I really loved is obviously you share the governance and the kind of risks and what we need to adhere to. But in true comms fashion, you go, let's flip the narrative. How can we change the way that we position this? Because ultimately we need to sell it to our stakeholders to say, well, actually, this is a good way of doing things. And one thing really struck me around how patients or case studies may not want to relive their experience for a photo. And that is actually something that I've come across when I used to work in NHS communications. You know, they would do the interview, but then in terms of the imagery, they wouldn't want to do it. So, but it was still a really powerful story. So it's like, how can we use AI responsibly in order to plug that gap? So that's something that kind of really resonated with me in my previous experience as an NHS communicator. But a lot of you guys on the webinar are asking for the slides. Don't worry, you're going to get them. You're going to get the recordings, everything. So yeah, this will all be to hand for you to share with your teams if some of them couldn't make it today. So now we've understood the nuts and bolts behind AI imagery in the governance. I'm going to hand you over to Scott now, who is going to take us through the creative process and how we can use AI in imagery, but not lose the kind of person behind it and the gut instinct. So over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Kerry, for giving us full permission to do whatever we want. Yeah, just stick a policy on the bottom. Alas, it's not that simple. But as we go to the next slide, please, Sky. Before we leap into the colouring in, which I know is one of Rachel's favourite sayings, because people do like to start colouring. If we go to the next slide, please, Sky. I think it's worthwhile just recapping on the creative process that gets us to the end. And as Kerry was talking about, it covers the whole aspect of the creative and production process if we let it or want it to. And I and my team tend to think of it now as a sort of production assistant in the room, which is great, but obviously works a lot quicker and can process data a lot faster for us too. So going back to the original process, we can use AI in pre-production, production and post-production. So it could be, we can use it for research, tools like Perplexity. Of course, across the internet, we can throw things into it as well. For ideation as well, so you might have an idea already and you can throw it at the LLM, whether you're using Copilot or ChatGPT or Gemini, and you can start to just throw a few ideas around it. Obviously, AI will be a positive bias, so you've got to be careful with the biases you're looking at there. But again, it can just help us with that. It can help us with storyboards and scripting, which I'll show you through later how we go about doing that. Of course, into production, now a lot of AI conversation and concern can be around generative AI, and we've heard from Kerry there around about the governance and prioritizing that trust within what we're trying to create if we do use AI to generate. But it doesn't have to replace the camera crew or the art director. We still use our human judgment, whether we're doing a frame, a still, or a full-blown animation, because it can help us with live transcription. So, you might just have somebody on camera, or you're catching a consultant coming out of a theatre and you've got a few moments. You want to make sure that you've captured the things you've got, so you can use AI to do a live transcription through there. Shot logging, so when you're doing a bigger film or a bigger production, there's a lot that goes on, and that whole process can take days, because depending on how much footage you've got. So you can use AI to go through that, and based on your criteria and your search, what you're looking for, you can pull it out there. You can check for continuity, obviously monitor quality, and this stuff would just would have taken ages before, but now we're able to go through it a lot quicker. And as Kerry said, in post-production now, there are tools that will edit. So for podcasts, for example, all the ums, the ers, the filler words that we use, AI can automatically go through that. There's tools like Opus Clip, which will take a whole film. Maybe it's a 1 hour webinar on AI, and it'll clip it out based on your criteria. So there's a lot that it can do. But the important thing is that we're not just making the content quicker. When it's used well, it can help us to make better decisions whilst we're creating on the shoot, or work smarter and quicker when we got there. So we're not using it to replace creativity. We're just using it to help remove the friction within that. As we go on to the next slide, you'll see an image to the right there, and this is created by our photographer. So we have a client, Baby Shop, based out in the UAE, in Dubai, and they have a sort of high-end brand within that called Giggles. Think think of very, very expensive mamas and papas, if you like, and they wanted us to go on a shoot because their aspiration for that their audience has out there is to be seen around all these really nice locations in European cities. Now, for us to go and do that, obviously there was a large budget behind it, but the client wasn't utterly convinced that it would work. So as part of the conceptualizing process, rather than us kind of just doing what we would normally do, if we give it to someone who's a professional in that craft, the way that they prompt is very different to how you and I may prompt. So for example, the prompt they got here was to create a cinematic tracking shot using a 35mm anamorphic lens, and so that's already telling what the type of image it is. So you can see that we've got a slightly blurred background there, and it's early morning, so the lighting is going to be done that way. And a young mother walks slowly through a quiet shopping street, pushing a pram. The camera tracks along the side there, and the city continues around her, but emotionally she exists in a world occupied by just her and the two people that she's carrying in her pram. Mood, quiet, protective, hopeful and observational, and the camera tech you can see there. And within that, you can just see the detail that we're putting in, because that's what we want to do. Kerry mentioned AI slop as well, and that's because when you put in bad stuff, you just get bad stuff back out again. It's the same with music. Back in the day, I would I would be practicing for hours and hours, whereas now I can just create a drum loop within minutes with the technology that's there. So as we move on to the next slide, AI can do some of those tricky things, but what can help us with the impossible? So we're going to see a couple of examples of that where we've saved quite a bit of budget by not going to the Himalayas for a chocolate brand that we work with, to show them how it might look if we're trying to climb up a mountain. Obviously using a lens on that would be quite tricky. And on the next slide, this is a very technical shot. So this was created in AI again using Mid-Journey and a number of different prompts that we use, but there's no way you could have a drone flying that high over the North Sea, let alone the health and safety of the worker on top. It just wouldn't happen. But as a powerful shot in a film that they wanted to create, you can see how that works. So a reasonable question might be to ask, can AI create content for me? But I think there's a deeper and a longer strategic creative question, which is more, how can AI help us communicate more effectively? How can it build the trust that Kerry said was, is fundamental in anything we're creating, whether we're using AI to do it or not? But how can it really resonate with our audience, whether that's the service users we're trying to reach within the community, or stakeholders across our trusts? Because, communication, storytelling, brand building is about, changing how people think and feel. So we look at the story as we go through this, and this is one of my favorite slides because we've got Pixar. And for those that don't know, Pixar spent a long time working out the story arc. I know there's a debate around the sort of creative aspects of using AI, but Toy Story, even in its infancy, we all thought was amazing when it first came out because of the level of CGI and graphics that it could do. And that's just technology, but before then we had Mickey Mouse and flip books. It's just the technology, but the speed of how that's delivered now is changing, of course. And communications, as we know, is about us telling our stories of our organizations and people in the community we work in. But we can borrow these story structures that people like Pixar use, because it's not about the animation. They're successful because they understand how people process the stories. And I think, and my challenge to you as you're thinking about how to use AI in your day-to-day work and campaigns, is that how do we help people then build emotion with the stories we're trying to tell? It doesn't start with the animation. It doesn't start with us coloring in. It starts way back when we're in the pre-production process, as we looked at earlier. It starts with a character. It starts with conflict sometimes, a trouble, a difficulty, an illness, a disability maybe, but then goes into transformation. And the same story structures you see behind Toy Story, Finding Nemo, and Up can help us uncover the human side of the story inside a clinical service, a patient journey, or an organizational change. And AI can help us develop those ideas into narratives and how to tell that story. But what is the Pixar story spine? Well, I've distilled it really quickly because you've got a few minutes to talk to you here. But it's essentially, we meet the hero. Who are they? We understand their world. What does life look like today? And then something changes, a challenge or an opportunity appears, and then the journey begins. They take their first step. Obstacles arise. Things don't go quite to plan. A guide appears, or someone or something that helps them. And then the transformation happens and they begin the journey, and there's a new future, and life is different because of the journey that they've been on. And if you think think about Nemo, let's not think about the first 2 minutes of Nemo, because that's quite traumatic. Even now, age 52, I still have to fast forward that one. But we meet the hero, Marlin, the overprotective father, the understanding of the world. He keeps Nemo safe from every danger, if you remember. And then something changes because Nemo is captured by a diver. The journey then begins as Marlin sets out to find his son. He bumps into sharks and jellyfishes and whales in the open ocean. But then his guide appears as Dory. Keep on swimming, keep on swimming. So that's her guide. And then the transformation as Marlin learns to trust Dory and where they're going. And Nemo himself finds courage. And then the new future is father and son return home. So if we try and map that back to our challenges that you might face, and how can it help with some of our impossible challenges? And as Kerry and Alenka alluded to, sometimes there is a process and a journey that the people that we're profiling in a case study or a media release has gone through, and we don't want to take them back to that trauma, but we do want to tell their story. So if you look at an impossible challenge, I work with Sparks Life. I'm also a trustee on their board. They're a Black-led charity, and they work with disadvantaged young people to prevent harm and promote life. They're typically involved in youth violence and other criminality. And Sparks Life themselves, they work with local authorities, schools and police across the criminal justice system, and whether that's prevention, stopping them getting into gangs, or once they're in gangs, helping them get out and rehabilitating them and helping them make better life choices, or if they end up in prison, then they will get alongside them when they're inside, but also out. Then they work across early prevention, enhanced prevention, and detached work. So they'll even be on the street talking to people. So as a favor for this event, we thought we'd create a film that was around sorry, go back a slide, please, Sky. We create a film that sort of told Henry's story. So Henry's story is that he grew up witnessing domestic violence because of his father's severe mental illness. This led to family breakdown and him getting kicked out and finding temporary accommodation in a hostel, and he was emotionally traumatized as a result of that. Being where he was then, he became highly vulnerable and criminally exploited by gangs and assaulted and ended up in hospital. And to cope, he developed a serious drinking problem. Then 12 months later, he was referred to Sparks to Life. A mentor and a caseworker got alongside him and very patient and compassionate, and helped him to understand, bearing in mind this is a sort of 18, 19-year-old lad at this point, how to make more positive decisions and not get involved in sort of revenge attacks. Works on him, Sparks Life helped him return to the family home and building a more healthy relationship with his mum, helped him to find some work and look for jobs, and rather than being involved in the gangs, develop some new skills, and then engage with some alcohol support services to do that. So we go to the next slide. We then go into our AI, and obviously we've been training this for a while, so it comes up quite quickly. But we look at the story spine that we put to Henry's story. So there's an ordinary world that he sits in. His home, his life is difficult. There's violence, which is the inciting incident. So back to the Pixar story spine, and then his journey begins. It goes wrong for him because he gets into the wrong crowds. He then hits his lowest point, which is in the hospital, and then a guide appears, which is Spark to Life, and the transformation begins. And then we see the healing. Now the storyboard you see on the right, again, created and generated by AI based on the literally the case study we saw on the last page, which was from their website, because I wanted to show us how we could do that. So we'll go to the next slide and run VT, please, Sky. Lovely. Thanks, Guy. So that was all made in AI, even the animation within there. And you could see and hear how we brought that to life. Now, the interesting part of that is we mix both the AI world and the real world. And the post-production process was the editing and how that kind of sharpened up what the AI had produced. And then we went into the audio post-production process where you could hear the sound effects. Because like any animation, because that's all it is, we've just used a different tool to create our animation. We can tell the story using the other things we had there. Yes, we could have done a voiceover, and we could have used 11 labs to create us a voice and a persona. But for this purpose, we stayed there. And for those that are interested, we used predominantly a tool called Higgsfield.ai. So we go to the next slide and we look at a fresh approach to how maybe you could use this across yours. And I don't know whether Hannah Crouch is on this webinar. Have a quick look for me, please, Alenka. But sorry to use you unannounced as our test case, as it were. But this is obviously a post that's gone up on the Barts Health Trust website by Hannah earlier this year, and we're just using this. I don't know anything about obviously I live in East London, so I know who they are, but I don't know anything about the Alcohol Prevention Service. I don't know what went into it there, but we start this within this case study. The alcohol care team at the Royal London Hospital identifies patients with alcohol dependency early and then connects them to specialist support. There's a chap that they reference called Ian in this, and he's drinking escalated during COVID following a serious head injury. He struggled to stop drinking on his own, various unsuccessful attempts, and went into rapid relapse each time, which got worse, and then he was referred to the alcohol care team. They provided medical supervision, coordinated care, and access to community support, giving Ian the help he couldn't achieve alone. 4 months later, he described the service as being life-saving, saying he feels better than he has in 5 years, and the service then looks to improve patient outcomes going forward. So if we go to the next slide, who's the hero in this story? If we go back to the Pixar story spine, we need a hero and we need a guide. Now, we may on our day-to-day, because we're surrounded by the place we work, think actually the alcohol dependency team are the heroes, or our trust is the hero. Well, actually, if we flip that and we make Ian the hero, then Bart's and the alcohol care team become the guide, and they help him to do what he wants. So then we use 2 prompts. And don't worry, we're not gonna play an animation on this. I'm looking at the clock as well, so I'm glad we did that. But if you just push play for me, so you can see what came out. So it's very simple prompts that we used. Yes, it was into our AI, but I've got another one later coming, which is different. Prompt number 1, here's a case study. So we cut and paste the URL into the AI, and we also copy and paste the text for good measure. So there we go. And we ask it to rework the story spine, use creativity to add names and situations, and who's going to be our hero? Is it the guide or that? Then I ask it to run me a prompt. And so you always have to be nice to the AI, because in the future we will be run by machines. So I always say, love that, because ChatGPT is super positive to me on a dark winter's night. So why not me the other way around? Can you create a storyboard prompt, photorealistic rather than animation, to tell the story and set the scenes across 12 frames? So now we go on to the next slide, please, Sky. And you can see what's been output here. So once upon a time, he enjoyed work life with friends, and after COVID, drinking became his routine. A serious head injury changed everything. He was told he couldn't drink, but because of that, he tried to stop on his own. He failed. 4 days after treatment, he kept relapsing. And because of that, anxiety, guilt, and fear grew. He felt trapped and saw no way out. Because of that, he came into hospital and met the alcohol care team. The team listened, supported him, and with medical supervision and the right support, recovery became possible. Small steps forward, built his confidence and began to change. And Ian felt like himself again, healthier, stronger, and looking at. So we're telling the story across the frames. And you can use this if you're going to be doing a film, maybe with a crew. But you can do a lot of this work to, if you can brief your crew better, believe you me, that the output will be better as well. So, as we did for Sparks Live, you can get a sense of what you might be able to do. You could use this to create a flip book, maybe, and that tells the story in flippingbook.com or something like that, or a carousel on a LinkedIn post or Instagram. So just go to the next slide for us, please. So how do we prompt, and how do I prompt like a professional producer or creative? So if we go to the next slide, basically, you know, you don't have to be a prompt engineer. I've not studied prompt engineering. I spent a lot of time creating a lot of stuff, of course, and watch a number of videos and all the rest of it. But we don't have the time to do that. But what we do is we can make AI be our prompt engineer. So we can give it the loosest of instructions and give it some reference material. Thank you, Kerry. Sorry, and all done. So this has all been done in Copilot. So we start with the end in mind. That's what we're trying to do. What's the story we're trying to tell? What's the story to be told? We then give our LLM a baseline. And like I say, I use Copilot for this. And we ask it to create a prompt. So yeah. So provide a source image, and then acting as an art director, analyze this image and break out the component parts from camera angle, shot composition, and lighting. And that would give us something similar to what you saw Ben, my photographer, create in the earlier image. And then we say, create a prompt from this for me to use for 2 images. But we want the prompt to ask us a question. What are we creating? And who is it for? You know, and who's the shot? Who's in the shot? What's that going on? And then we go on to start telling the story. So you open up a new chat. So ignore that old one. I know you can keep things going. You can have projects and stuff, but just go into a completely new chat. Open it up. And insert the web link as you saw me do before, and then get it to answer you the 2 questions. And then got another slide. And then from that, for this purposes, I decided that our case study person, now bearing in mind we don't know anyone, you know, in there, and this is a story about ephysemia, and June is the person I've imagined out of thin air. I don't know anything about June, but I've said that June's a 50-year-old woman from southeast London, and the team, and this is for the Royal Brompton Trust, sorry, are the guides who went through this treatment and a positive outcome. So this is the framework. You know, we see the challenge that she went through, and the guide appears and the plan, and they get a path forward, and they get in the transformation, and life's changed and life comes back to normal. And the final prompt was to create a storyboard image with that. So you can see, even with the barest of information, how we can just bring something to life. And as Kerry was talking about, obviously, I don't know at this stage of the game whether these images are correct, and we can prompt the AI accordingly. So in summary, you know, as we're looking to prompt, you know, and think of our purpose before we do that. Next slide, please, Sky. Always looking to use our human judgment and working within the organization's governance and ethical framework. But certainly don't let that stop you exploring what's possible. And if anything, it can give you lots of ideas around that. So remember that the technology doesn't create the great communication. It's what we do. It's what we're wanting to get from it, and use it as a partner, but not as a replacement. And, you know, it can generate, you know, the scripts. It can, you know, even for your social clips as well, you know, you can ask it to run passes on that and act as a social media producer and things, but use it across the whole process, not just for generative AI, and use it to give you some inspiration and some ideas too.
Lovely, thank you, Scott. If you could go to the next slide, please, Sky. So now it is time for questions. So we have about 8 minutes for questions. I've seen quite a few coming through. And I just want to say, Scott, thank you so much for that. I love how you linked it back to the Pixar story spine, because that's something all of us, no matter whether you're 2 years old or 200-year-old, we've all seen a Pixar film and we can all relate back to it. And actually what you said around the story spine for that actually applies to so many things that we would do in healthcare communications. But what I also loved is how, you know, you said we're all going to be taken over by AI machines. I don't think we are, Scott, because you've just basically echoed how much is really important that we have the creative brain behind the storyboarding and the animation and all that kind of stuff. So I think you've made sure that we've creative and comms have continued to get a job, keep our jobs for the next 10 to 20 years at least.
I was talking more about the petrol pump where he goes, no, I'm not going to give you some petrol. I'll give some to Kerry because she's nicer to me on the chat.
Brilliant.
But thank you.
So we've got some questions coming through. So the first question is from Claudia, and she has asked, is there any evidence of AI generated images or campaigns moving the dial in terms of changing behavior? And how has it been measured against non-AI campaigns and content? Oh, that's a tricky one. It might be a bit too early to say. What do you guys think? Kerry, do you want to come in first?
I think it might be too early to say. From the research that I've been doing in terms of how sort of the asking that sort of information about AI use with it, especially within healthcare, it's been predominantly about it being used within the service provision, and there's not actually much information out there at the moment in terms of how generative AI image visuals are changing behaviours and all the rest of the stuff. So like I said before, it's a really thin line to walk at the moment in terms of how people feel about it, which is why I'm all about the transparency side of things, and why I think that Connect Support case study was a really great way of showcasing, yes, we have used AI and this is why, because I think there's so much power within the why, and that's what I think will lead to that change in behavior, and that because it's the understanding, right?
Yeah, perfect. Scott, did you want to come in on that at all, on any
Yeah.
thoughts? Being in the creative world.
I think the short answer is it's just a tool. So in the same way, it's like saying, how can a Mickey Mouse flipbook create emotion and user engagement? And people are using it now. And there's, the G-pad that Kerry was sharing with us earlier today. That's using other technologies as well. So for me, it's how you're using it as opposed to saying it's just AI. How do you get AI to do it? And when we're talking about the story, that's the piece that people are missing sometimes. And when you flip it and flip the narrative, you can help it to tell your story better. I remember when I was at uni, I was right there when we moved from almost like the dark room to the digital piece that Kerry was talking about. I'm a musician, I'm a drummer, and if I was having to play a bass drum for, I don't know, 6 hours for a rave, I would probably run, the tempo would stop and nothing would kind of work. But with technology and computers, you just put the bass drum in, boom, 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 and then cut and paste, and you run it for the 6 hours. And people don't mind. They don't mind. The issue is, I think, because AI is so easy to use and so easy to create, the things that you've dreamt of, that you then get pulled down that rabbit hole rather than how am I trying to use that tool, and how do I, AI would be used across all sorts of things in the same way that CGI was. And if you go back to Star Wars Episode 1, which was using some incredible CGI, and George Lucas was using some new groundbreaking techniques, it looked rubbish because it just didn't look great. Fast forward four episodes and you got the return of Luke Skywalker. There's AI across all of that. There's green screen across that. There's all sorts of things, and you believe it because it's all got a bit better. So it's at the point where you kind of believe what's going on. I know on social media there's a lot of sort of fakery and trickery and people pretending to be a thing, and okay, fine, but that's not the business we're in, right? We're in the business of healthcare and communicating that in the right way, and we can just use AI to amplify that.
Definitely. Thank you. We've got another. Yes,
sorry,
go on, Kerry.
From a change management point of view as well, I think it's really key to point out that people think that, oh, no one likes change, but that's actually quite inaccurate. And actually it's more of a bell curve in terms of people who love change and are like early adopters and people who are really resistant to it. And what makes the difference is people understanding and managing expectations and communicating the change and the reasons and all the rest of it. That's what helps sort of navigate that change that we are going to see. The things that obviously Scott touched on, and like quite rightly said, with green screens and all the rest of it, it's everywhere already. It's just because it's become a accessible tool for everybody, which there are obviously a lot of risks involved with that as well.
Thank you, guys. We've got another question from Ava. Ava says, thank you. This was a really useful session. We are very glad. That's what we're here for. She said, this may be a silly question, but it's not. There's no silly questions here. But once you have the story frame generated from AI, how do you then use this to translate it into video content? Do you have any advice for a beginner looking to learn? Scott, can you advise on any potential tools that Ava could use?
So you can use that to do a lot of the heavy lifting, to give you some ideas. So if you're going out and filming, then you've got your scene set already. So you can use it for that. If you're wanting to do something like what we did with Henry's story and create the animation, then there's a lot more involved and there's a lot more craft in that. But you're using tools like Higfield or Midjourney, even in Gemini. Gemini's got some really good video creation in there because there's nano bananas sort of powering it. So you can do that. So you get your storyboard. So you got your 12 frames, and then ask, if you're feeling creative, then start by going, okay, how do I translate that that frame, and what do I want it to look like? And you can use the reference image that you've created if you want to, and then do that for each one, but do it separately and create separate mini clips, I suppose, for each of those frames, and then you edit those together, and then you put the audio post on underneath, as you saw with Henry's story, and that will then help bring it to life. So break it down frame by frame, pretty much, both for the prompt and the output, and then you stitch it together, rather than going, do me a 3-minute film about this. It's just bite-sized chunks, and that will really help the AI to give you what you want, but keep that reference image in there.
Brilliant. And then just following on from tools, we have another question from Serena. Hi, Serena. So any other tools you recommend similar to Opus Clip? We're looking into it, but having lots of hurdles with procurement.
Well, assuming you've got Copilot, you can use Copilot almost to do the same sort of thing. So I was doing this for a client yesterday, actually, where we're looking to take some long form material and make lots of LinkedIn posts out of it and all that kind of stuff. And so what you do is you get a transcript of the film that you've made, or the recording of the rushes, and you can use Fireflies or Claude or any of those tools that do instant, or Descript is really good actually as a creative tool as well. And then from there, you ask, prompt Copilot acting as a producer, and I usually say broadcast journalist, just because it kind of makes them feel a bit more fancy. Provide 10 social clips that are really interesting from this transcript, and it'll do it for you. So Opus Clip is great. The demos look amazing, but depending on the content, and it doesn't quite work in your favor sometimes. So I would kind of go back a step. We in the old days we'd call it a paper edit. So you've got your timestamps on the transcript, and you just ask the prompt to say, prompt me, give me the 5 clips, give me the timestamps, and then it will give you an output, and then you go back to your video file or audio if you're doing a podcast and edit from there. So treat it like a paper edit process, because Opus Clip isn't always the answer. It can just create stuff that it thinks works. It's good for rating, but I wouldn't worry too much about that particular tool.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And then one final question, and this one is for Kerry. Kerry, do you have any advice on how you would explain to a client, stakeholder or patient as to why you've used AI in an image?
It depends on the situation, I suppose. Like if it's like we talked about in terms of a sensitive sort of situation, and it makes sense that it's not appropriate to use real imagery or visuals in that way, that's the reason. So it is about being really transparent with the decisions that you have taken to understand why AI is the best approach. Like it might not be. I mean, obviously if the decision is budget, we're not allowed to get real life photography to do this, so we're cutting corners, that's not a valid reason at all. But it's about understanding and having those conversations. I'm very much a sort of obviously a communications person, and I'm about having those conversations and understanding what the resistance is with your client or your patient or whoever the stakeholder is in terms of their sort of unwillingness or like their reservations of using AI. If you can understand the why, then you can explain the relevance of using it and how it works in that way. Equally, if they're really dead against it, you have to respect that and at a different angle, I suppose. At the end of the day, that's how I would approach it.
Definitely. Thank you, Kerry. So our session has whizzed by today. Thank you all very much for your comments, your questions. I can see them all in the chat. It's brilliant. What we'll do is we'll send out the YouTube link to the video of this recording that you can share with your teams. But here is just a bit about Scott, Kerry and the Blue Lozenge team if you'd like to get in touch with us regarding anything related to not just AI and imagery, but anything creative, governance or communications in general. We are here to help. So thank you very much. Stay cool in the heat, and we'll speak to you all soon. Thank you, everybody.